Welcome to a presentation on the SSND educational story. In the SSND tradition, we say that we make one by proclaiming the gospel through education. We are educators in all that we are and do. And like Mother Teresa, we educate with the conviction that the world can be changed through the transformation of persons. Educating children, youth, women, the disenfranchised, the elderly. Educating in schools, parishes, in programs designed to meet special needs. Educating in English, Spanish, Portuguese, Creole, Japanese, Italian, to name but a few. Educating in the United States, the far reaches of British Columbia and the Northwest Territories, Canada and South America, Asia, Africa, and Europe. Educating in cities and suburbs, in rural America and in the favelas of Brazil, and the barrios of Honduras, and in the remote parts of Nepal, and in the gymnasiums of Germany. Educating from morning until night. We are about a grand enterprise. And while we are not all joined at the level of program, we are intimately connected at the level of the Spirit. The bonds that unite us are far stronger than the differences that describe us. The spiritual energy of the sacred stories that we share in common are the sources of our inspiration and the wellspring of our lives. Bringing all to oneness and communicating God's love to others is at the heart of the SSND educational vision. It's very hard to describe the spirit of something. It's hard to put words around it. Perhaps the best I can do is identify some of the elements of the spirit of SSND education. What is it, anyway? I ask myself, is this a sacred story about the story of Teresa Gerhardinger? Is it a story about God? And I think for me, I've come to believe that it is a story about love and faith and hope. In so many ways, it's like a narrative resurrection story, God at work in Teresa. And love springs forth, and hope is poured out, and faith makes all things possible. And every time we tell the story and reflect on it, it holds a different meaning. We hear it read over and over again, and we recite it and we repeat it, and we never hear it the same way twice. The spirit of it fills our being, and we struggle to write it down. And yet it slips through our fingers. We know when we have it, and we know when it's absent. It's bigger than we are, and yet it compels us to do more than we can ever hope to imagine. It is somewhat like a prism of grace, like pure beams of sunlight being cast upon the earth. The surprising piece is that this spiritual energy resides in us. We can never underestimate the power of good that moves through us. It moves us to greatness. And so the sacred story is unfinished. We're writing it with our lives. A vision comes from someplace. Willis Harman, in his book Global Mindset, tells the story of two stonecutters. And when asked what they were doing, the one says, "Well, I'm squaring this block of stone." And the second said, "I am building a cathedral." It's all in our vision of something. As Shakespeare put it, we enter a world of madness when we lose our vision. So where does the SSND educational vision come from? It's the convergence of many pieces, it seems to me. It's the coming together of individual faith and community faith. It's the dramatic breakthrough of the sacred into the life of young Caroline Gerhardinger and the saintly pastor Father George Michael Whitman. It's the inbreaking of God's love into the 19th century, following on a period of great moral decline. It's people who were reading the gospel the same way. It's a vision of shared meaning. And so the story is not all history. It's all wrapped up in mystery. Their hearts were set on the kingdom. And so, the message is rooted in the gospel. And it finds expression in the life of Caroline. And it unfolds with great passion and is communicated through action. The SSND story has always been about God and about others. It's framed in conviction, compassion, courage, humility, commitment. It is a divine and human story. We know the story, the dramatic breakthrough of the sacred into human experience. This vision had been dimmed during the Enlightenment and needed to be restored. The signs of moral decline were everywhere. Germany was becoming a godless society. And it was the driving desire of Father Whitman to reopen his parish school, closed by the government in 1809. The young girl, Caroline Gerhardinger, living there on the Danube, trained by the canonesses of Notre Dame, talented, spiritually available to the call of God, and trained as a teacher in this little school where young girls could be educated, seemed to be God's call to her. It was their vision that the Christian education of girls would restore family life, and in turn, German society. It was the spiritual vision of Father Whitman and Caroline, along with their friends, Father Siegert and Father Job, and the first lay teachers that began to give shape to the dream of changing their world. I'm reminded of a line from the movie Tucker that says, "Don't get too close to people, you may catch their dreams." I think that's what happened. It really is a story about a small circle of friends, like-minded in spirit and heart, dedicated to a common vision of service for the good of others that shapes our early years. And under Father Whitman's spiritual guidance, Caroline gradually recognizes that God is calling her to found a religious community which would be dedicated to responding to society's needs through education. The congregation traces its beginning to 1833, when Caroline and two young women begin a common religious life. She takes the name Mary Teresa of Jesus and dedicates her new community to Mary and creates an apostolic way of life that chooses Christian education of girls as her service to the world. Mother Teresa's spirituality deeply influenced the spirituality of her congregation. And so we step back and look inside that story to learn and understand more about our own, because we share intimately in that sacred story. We are educators in this tradition. We are carriers of the vision. We are ministers of meaning. We are standing with and alongside thousands of others in our institutions and places of work, communicating God's love and assisting them to realize their fullest potential and hopes, and in turn, use their gifts for the common good. Key to any idea of institutional living is the goal to be sure it has a tomorrow. So a careful consideration of institutional behavior recognizes that we need to keep the spiritual gifts available to the people we serve. It is never fully captured in any one moment of history, because it is like that prism, pure beams of sunlight. Some colors are accentuated at one time, then at another. It places its energies at the service of the world. It has a future orientation. It yearns to be set free. And so we struggle to translate this spiritual energy into action. Our history, the history of our institutions, won't change. But the way we integrate the growth of our times and bring love and service to all the people we serve will need to change. You know, we can't organize the Holy Spirit. So the dynamic, generative life of the institution is a gift. We want to give it a future. So it will, by necessity, need to change in order to do its mission. It's very difficult to touch the heartbeat of the story. It's not just about the historical situations that Blessed Teresa found herself in, but it's a story about her relationship with God. It's the constant interplay between the divine and the human. Her gifts, her personality, her spiritual availability became the means of grace to be given to the whole church. Her gifting gave new expression to the gospel. Her ever-deepening relationship with God is what provides the spiritual energy for her work. This spiritual gifting, this grace, this energy has made its way through our history. Gifts are like pure beams of sunlight, broken up into a prism. They show themselves in different ways, in different historical times, in different places. The key, root, charismatic elements are the wellsprings of our life and our work. They function in a rational way through the institution. The institution, the corporate effort of our service, makes the charism available. The institution tries to harness all of this spiritual energy, and it never really does. And so we keep going back to those key root experiences, those shaping experiences, trying to figure out, what is it saying to us? What are the breakthrough moments for us as we consider who we are and who we are called to be and what we are called to do? People with a strong sense of roots have a strong sense of identity. You know, there were only blurred distinctions between Mother Teresa's life and her work. In many ways, it was one and the same. Her life was a lived expression of the gospel. Education was her way to holiness. It was her vocation. And we can hear her say, "Speak more to God about the children than to the children about God." This theme runs through the whole understanding of service. Our work and our prayer are intimately connected. So we're always faced with the question, does our educational work stand in the service of proclaiming the gospel? Can it be felt and seen in our institution? For Father Job, it was proclamation. His whole concern was for the spread of the faith. In his mind, it was not the concern for the school which characterized the work of the school sisters, but it was the work of the gospel. The school, in his mind, is justified only as long as the proclamation of the gospel takes place. It was so important to Mary Teresa of Jesus, to Father Job, to Father Whitman, that the teachers grasp God's love for them and for the children. Schools became communities of shared meaning. It's this vision that has made its way through SSND history and has helped to shape our institutions. It is in the spirit of the Constitution, the little book about the size of the Gospel of John, written by Father Job, where he outlines the spirit that should guide the sisters' lives. He pens his vision of Christian education in his mind. It's only a combination of instruction and formation of the heart that deserves the name education. It is the alpha and the omega of the school. The Christian educator, by virtue of his or her profession, is called and obligated to a deeply spiritual life. One can only educate who draws out of the fullness of the heart. For Father Job, the only way for education to impart spirit and life is to have lived in union with God. After writing the spirit of the Constitution, Father Job asked Mary Teresa to look over his scribbles and to make any changes she felt were necessary. She made no changes. They were of one mind and one heart. We know that it is this vision that has shaped the SSND educational vision and social vision of the 19th, 20th, and now into the 21st century. For Teresa, Father Whitman, Father Job, the person was valued and loved by a gracious God. This vision was the driving force of their service. It was all about love. Coupled with this very compelling spiritual vision was a kind of educational pedagogy that supported these beliefs. A prevailing educational reformer of the time, Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi, in the 1800s, promoted pedagogical ideas that were compatible and espoused by Mary Teresa and Father Whitman. In many ways, Pestalozzi's life was riddled with failures, and yet it seems that what emerged from his own experience of defeat was an educational practice based on the love for children. Over time, his ideas became prominent in educational circles. He argued that children should learn through activity. They should be free to pursue their own interest and draw their own conclusions. Children should use to develop their own powers of seeing and judging and reasoning. For the aim of education, in his view, was to educate the whole child, all the powers of the child. In his view, education was more than intellectual. It was total human development. This was a real departure from traditional educational thought, where many believed that the intellect was the only concern of education. For him, the inner dignity of the person was at the heart of his work. Running through much of Pestalozzi's writings is that education should be moral as well as intellectual. He had a real heart for the poor and felt strongly that education was the only way to improve their lives. Personality was sacred, and love of those you educate is the sole and everlasting foundation of work. Without love, one cannot develop one's potential. Kindness ruled his educational work. He wrestled with the tension between the education of the individual and the education of the citizen. He believed strongly that society could be changed through education. He held a strong commitment for social justice, and he was a daily practitioner with great sympathies for the disenfranchised. I think it is his book, Leonard and Gertrude, written in 1781, that bears such a strong resemblance to our own SSND story. It is the account of a woman who first reforms her house and then her whole village. This little book was, as you could say today, on the bestseller list in Germany. This little book, for the first time, promotes the value of education for women. The power to change society resided in the education of women. One of Pestalozzi's pupils, Froebel, takes his teacher's principles and moves them through the development of the kindergarten movement in Germany, another key shaping experience for early SSND history. And so we begin to see a spiritual vision with educational practice. Faith is wed to methodology and creates meaning. Mary Teresa of Jesus and those with whom she worked had a passion for proclaiming the gospel of love. They were well acquainted and trained in the educational pedagogy of Pestalozzi and Froebel. The way they conducted their schools was visible to everyone, and as a result, everyone came looking for them. As timing was everything, 14 short years after the founding of the congregation, Mary Teresa brings the congregation to North America. And the first group of sisters, among them Caroline Fries, then 26, born of a French mother and a German father. And it is Sister Caroline who, with those who joined her, changes the SSND North American landscape. On many accounts, bringing young Sister Caroline to North America would be considered foolish. She was too young, too outspoken, and too inexperienced. And yet, Mary Teresa saw in her the potential for adaptation and said of her, "I know God speaks to her heart." With this implicit trust, Mary Teresa returns home. Clearly, Mary Teresa was bold enough to come, and Sister Caroline was brave enough to stay. The U.S. soil and spirit was ready for them. Equality, idealism, the glaring needs of the new immigrants, the young church yearning and struggling to survive were waiting for them. It was an ever-changing world. The expansion of North America is really a story filled with miracles. The struggles were enormous, and despite the hardships, the work of the sisters expanded from 4 schools to 18 schools in just 8 years. They were making a tremendous social contribution. Their concerns were always about ordinary people, especially the immigrant poor and the underside of society. The early SSND pioneers in North America, through their spiritual and educational leadership, moved the congregation towards a more just and truly human world. While professional competency was necessary for her sisters and their efforts to educate future mothers, it was not enough. She continually urged them to seek the inner center of their lives and in the God they found there. They would hear her say, "May Jesus be the way you go, the truth you follow, and the life you lead." From the 19th century into the 20th century, from the Civil War through 2 world wars, from the development of the Catholic school system through a period of continued expansion and stabilization, we see the spiritual gifts of the congregation at work. There has been a persistent thread of unity, despite all of the changes that have occurred in 170-some years of history. Generation after generation of school sisters and those with whom they work have assigned faith to learning. They have worked tirelessly to bring faith to bear on their cultural reality. Through all of this history, we cannot help but see a great deal of spiritual continuity in the midst of great historical discontinuity. This seal symbolizes and links our past with the present. It will take us to the future. The seal, with its motto, dates back to the time of Mother Caroline, and it's found in the catalog of St. Mary's Institute in Milwaukee in 1885. The open book with a 2-fold dedication of our lives. On the left, a rule book, and on the right, the educational purposes of the congregation. 2 pages, 1 book. Virtus, the dispositions of the soul, the practice of the virtues which will create the bond of unity. Virtues practiced and fostered by our foundress. Virtues that became the ruling passion of their lives. Apostolic zeal for the proclamation of the gospel, simplicity, humility, obedience, and poverty. Ciencia, a high regard for all that is excellent in the realm of education. A proficiency in the art of Christian education. Love for the children. The virtus is attained through the ciencia. This brings together the essence of SSND education. By the 1960s, the landscape of our reality was quite different. We had moved from an agricultural society to a highly industrialized and into an informational age. Coming from small beginnings in the town of Stockholm to becoming a worldwide congregation, living and working now in 30-some countries. The congregation is called by Vatican II, return to your roots, to renew, read the signs of the times. The Church in the modern world, the document of Vatican II, really placed us in the world. We were being called to be transformed by our culture, to be leaven in our societies. In order to approach this enormously large spiritual task, we needed to return to our roots. We were challenged to rethink, reconceptualize who we are and who we are called to be. How were we to place our spiritual gifts at the service of a rapidly changing world? It was a major spiritual earthquake. But the generative elements of the charism seeped through the cracks. It was a time of great soul searching. The circle had grown so much larger. How could this very complex, diverse congregation find its way to the future? It was a miracle. It took the same qualities of our foundress: courage, commitment, conviction, a love for the community, a great deal of honesty, humility, and compassion to bring about a whole transformative change. In the end, we wrote the vision down, trusting its time would come. To make one, to be Christ in the world, to share our love, faith, and hope. That's the mission. The sacred story of Mary Teresa is the story of love. It's the story of a relationship, born in faith, spilling out onto the world. Each of us is not only sacred, we are social. We grow in community, and this brings with it great responsibilities for all of us and for the common good. Our spiritual energies are placed at the service of all humanity. It is now one and then the other. The originating graces take on global expression. We struggled for new meanings for our ministry. For what had begun in Stadenhof can now be found just about anywhere in the world. We choose to express our mission through education, because the originating graces of proclamation through education is now needed more than ever. Witnessing and teaching to worldwide unity, total reliance on God, the promotion of human dignity gives concrete expression to the gospel. It's very interesting to trace the way we have defined education since the beginning. The key elements have been retained in every iteration of the documents. Here we see the two parts of our service described as reaching the fullness of one's potential, created in God's image, and using our gifts for the common good. The value of the human person is centered in gospel understanding, because the human person is the clearest reflection of God among us. People are more important than things. Each is precious and all is sacred. Each person possesses a basic human dignity that comes from God, not from race, or gender, or age, or economic status. Think of all the effort you make in your institution to keep the person as the centerpiece of your focus. It's the heart of our vision. Unlike large corporations, where money may be the bottom line, is what is looked at. The measure of every institutional policy is whether it enhances or threatens the human person. We have been assigned responsibilities never assigned to any other generation. The small village of Stadenhof was indeed a challenge, but putting our arms around the world is enormous. What is happening in our world was unthinkable in the days of Mary Teresa of Jesus. We now control forces that once controlled us. As educators, we need to assume responsibility commensurate with the greater knowledge that we have about the earth and the human community. The whole world is now our classroom. The social teachings of the Church are very clear. The basic test of any society is how we treat the most vulnerable members. From Mary Teresa and Father Whitman, the poor and the vulnerable had the most important place in God's love. This vision, as articulated in the social teachings, has always been a part of our tradition, pointing the way, working for peace and justice, caring for the poor and vulnerable, caring that knows no borders. We've always believed that everyone had a place at the table, that education is a basic human right, that education helps bent-over people stand up straight, that those who are voiceless find a way to speak, that human potential resides in each and every person. We are straddling two paradigms, and just as Mary Teresa and Caroline stood on one side of complexity in the 19th century and helped the German people and other immigrants move to the other side, we too are challenged to move to the other side from the 20th into the 21st century. Can we come to terms with the world we have created? Will education do that? Can we help others do that? In the SSND tradition, we must create a more just and truly human world. Kofi Annan, in accepting the Nobel Prize for Peace in Oslo in 2001, said that we've entered the third millennium through a gate of fire. And if today, after the horror of September 11, we see better and we see farther, we will realize that humanity is indivisible, with bonds that bind all of us in pain as well as in prosperity. The idea that there is one person in possession of the truth, one answer to the world's ills, or one solution to humanity's needs has done untold harm in human history. Today, real borders are not between nations, but between the powerful and the powerless, the free and the fettered, the privileged and the humiliated. We are setting our feet in a direction that builds peace through education. This is not easy. The struggles for a kind of education that does the work of justice is so countercultural. And yet it is our call, educating for a culture of peace. Peace comes only with justice. There is no question that this statement jolts our minds and our hearts. And unless we are willing to look deeply within ourselves and examine our larger visions, it will be very hard to help others do that. Education is not just doing business as usual. It's coming from a vision where the measure of our service is found in the gospel, where everyone has a place at the table. Carol Gilligan says that education is a nonviolent means of social change. So what is our way to the future? Our mission and congregational documents describe what can be thought of under three categories: global citizenship, global relationships, and global stewardship. And just as Caroline was trying to live in two worlds, Europe and America, we are trying to live in one. Now our commitment is to a global generation. We're called and challenged to develop new ways of thinking, formulating new images, fostering an ethic of care for the global community. As educators, Mary Teresa of Jesus and Mother Caroline sought to find God's way in the midst of chaos and social disintegration. Believe it or not, God is at work in this world of ours. So how do we empower people to use their gifts on the behalf of the common good in the face of such global complexity, diversity, and uncertainty? When we examine each of these paths more closely, we see how interconnected they are. And we begin to see that when we work at one, we are really working at them all. It is a shift in consciousness. We begin to see, though differently, we begin to see the world in a different way. We begin to understand it in a different way. We begin to love it in a different way. And we begin to act toward it in a different way. I think the lines from the book of Habakkuk where it says, "Write the vision down clearly on the tablet and wait for it. Its time will come," has something special to say to us. I think we're writing our story down. We're writing the vision down with our lives. The early story, the originating graces that gave birth to our story, the tradition that has been communicated generation after generation, the legacy of wonderful wisdom figures that have lived with great conviction and passion in our institutional lives, the commingling of the divine with human experience comes together in us, the living community. It is an unfinished story. With God's grace, we have been faithful to writing the vision down thus far and communicating it to people the world over. That part too is unfinished. Regardless of where we find ourselves, this vision just yearns to be shared. So how do we make it available to the future? Whether we are inside a formal school setting or in some other educational enterprise, we can reflect on our present situation in light of the values and principles that shape our lives and guide our practice. We can consider who is the social subject of our service and how are we meaningfully connecting with their world. Is our program built from the ground up out of this vision? We examine the content of our programs in the light of faith and the knowledge that is needed to live well in today's world. And we look at the community, the world reality, and we see how faith informs our relationships. And we ask ourselves, if the way we work together is collaborative, is it inclusive? Does it foster and respect human engagement? We're bringing forward the richness of our past and applying pedagogical principles that are grounded in our tradition. The human person is still in the center. Nothing more, nothing less. SSND education works from within. It is deeply spiritual in nature. It is soul-size work. It finds its strength and conviction deep within us and critically, lovingly confronts the reality before us. It works to develop a shift in consciousness, to see differently, to understand in a new way, to love more, and to act on behalf of the common good. It goes beyond service. It moves to action on behalf of others. It is the work of ordinary people that have enormous consequences. We are part of something much larger than ourselves. We are the carriers of a vision. We are the ministers of meaning. The miracle needed today is the work of ordinary people. People who are incredibly good and brave in crisis. We cannot predict the future, but we know that there is only one, and it belongs to all of us. The deepest dangers and the most exciting prospects for the future are not found outside of ourselves, in the external environment, but in the human heart. The work before us is indeed soul-size. As Chardin said so well, when we discover the power of love, we will for the second time have discovered fire. And Joan Chittister, in writing of charism, said, "It is the fire in the eye of God." So all of our history, all of the change, all of the suffering, and all of the violence cannot keep love and compassion, faith and hope from re-emerging. We are bringing love and learning together. We are people of proclamation. We are proclaiming that all of us are to be one. This afternoon we have been reflecting on our educational vision. Our everyday choices must resonate at a deep level with this vision. Imagine how Mary Teresa of Jesus and Caroline must have talked about these things, how they prayed together to know the future. They could not know it. They could not predict it. They could not produce it, but they lived into its promises. We have a captivating and bold history. It offers us a legacy of hope. The spiritual energies that reside inside our institutions is more than we can imagine. We must see education as our way of making one. We are convinced that learning is the conduit of grace, as our way to proclaiming the gospel. And so we end where we began. The story is unfinished. We are writing it with our lives. The bonds that unite us are far stronger than the differences that describe us. Let us go forth in love, faith, and hope.